And we are here to talk about what that means in Florida and why it is important that even as we celebrate this, we call on the Florida Legislature and the governor to make explicit into law that these protections exist, and also that the values of a state that is welcoming and inclusive to all be codified across the board in Florida, so that we are driven by the values of inclusivity and non-discrimination, not simply pushed forward by the courts. And so I want to introduce as our first speaker, John Davidson, who has a long history of litigating for LGBTQ rights and is now with Freedom for All Americans, and will give a brief legal overview of what this day means and what work remains. John Davidson.
Thanks, Nadine. Well, in the midst of the COVID-19 health crisis and the vitally important demonstrations in support of Black lives and against systemic racism, today's decision was certainly heartening and encouraging. This is a critically important moment for LGBTQ equality. I agree with Nadine that the court has unambiguously ruled that employers don't have a right to discriminate against LGBTQ people. The decision says that LGBTQ people are protected against discrimination in employment under federal law. But it's really important to understand that our work is far from finished. Our nation has much to do to dismantle both legal and cultural systems of racism, and there are still critical gaps in federal and state non-discrimination laws for LGBTQ people, despite the ruling. The ruling prohibits discrimination, says that prohibitions on discrimination based on sex encompass discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The court made clear, if you discriminated against me because I'm a man in a relationship with another man, but you wouldn't if I was a woman in a relationship with a man, you're discriminating against me based on my sex, because you would treat me differently if I was of a different sex. Similarly, if you discriminate against me because when I was born, I was identified as a man, but today I identify as a woman, you are discriminating against me because of your views about my sex. You think I'm not the right kind of woman or the right kind of man. And so the court has been very clear that that is now prohibited by federal law with respect to employment discrimination. It should also be prohibited under federal laws that bar discrimination based on sex in housing, credit, education, and healthcare. But the court did not expressly rule on that, and it will still have to be litigated. And it shouldn't have to be litigated. We need comprehensive express protections in sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in federal law and in state law. And even under federal law, there are no prohibitions against sex discrimination in public accommodations, in public spaces like hotels and restaurants or stores. And there are still no federal prohibitions on sex discrimination in federally funded programs and services like adoption services or shelters. So we need to have a federal law passed, and at the same time, we need states like Florida to pass an express and comprehensive ban on sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in all areas of life. It is that we need our state legislatures and Congress to catch up with the American public and the court. Recent polls show that 72% of Americans support having laws prohibiting sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. That's in all parts of the country, across all demographic groups. And it is time for the Florida legislature and Congress to act.
Thank you very much, John. We appreciate that. And And among the leading voices pushing our legislature to do precisely that, pass comprehensive non-discrimination policies, have been some of the biggest companies, business leaders in the state. And I want to turn now to Amy Ruth, who is Senior Vice President of Human Services and Chief Human Resource Officer at Florida Blue. Amy?
Thanks, Nadine. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. We celebrate today the Supreme Court ruling. We at Florida Blue, our mission is to help people and communities achieve better health. And for us, that means the entire community, every member in it. We've had a long-held belief that success should be about the quality of someone's work. Equality and inclusion are important parts of how we stay competitive in the recruiting space. We value diversity and we stand for inclusion, be it this important ruling for LGBTQ people or the Black Lives Matter movement. We have intentionally embraced a culture where all team members can be their best selves at work. This ruling is a good start and we're happy for it, but we will keep working until the LGBTQ community has the full protections that they're deserved, especially here in Florida.
Thank you, Amy. And next, I want to turn to John Tonneson, who, in addition to being the Executive Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Tech Data, has chaired Florida Competes, which is a coalition of business leaders who have been pushing for the passage of the Florida Competitive Workforce Act and opposing efforts that would undermine protections that currently exist. John Tonneson.
Hey, thanks, Nadine. Good afternoon to Florida and all of you. Just thrilled to be here today, both representing Tech Data, as Nadine has said, but also Florida Competes, an association of 11 Fortune 500 companies, 37 large employers, and 450 small businesses across the state of Florida, putting their weight and confidence behind a drive for the Florida Competitive Workforce Act to enshrine the kind of protections for the LGBT community that have been long afforded to others. So thrilled to be able to be having this conversation today. I've spent time in Tallahassee lobbying on behalf of the Competitive Workforce Act, and I serve as the sponsor, the executive sponsor for our corporation's LGBTQ business resource group. So today carries a huge weight for both me personally and professionally. Tech Data, a global business, 40 countries, happens to be headquartered here proudly in Florida. And one of our core values is inclusion. And because of that, we've been supporting the mission for legislation and clarification of laws in this way for a very long time on behalf of our colleagues and on behalf of their families, friends, and neighbor. Today's landmark, worthy of huge celebration, but we also note that we're no way finished on the pursuit of inclusion and equality for all people. So noteworthy. I hope and expect that our state, our legislature, our governor takes these clear rulings and signals as encouragement and a basis on which to drive for further systematic change and improvement, furthering the cause of true equality throughout Florida, that we can declare proudly that Florida is open and open for all. So thanks to colleagues, friends, leaders, and the community members that have pushed this mission, pushed this sentiment, pushed this need so effectively over the last years, and now we join forces to forge ahead and turn this clear signal from the Supreme Court into localized, specific legislation and protections throughout our great state of Florida.
Thank you, John. And for folks, you can follow in the chat. There's a link that will take you to the full Florida Competes coalition. You can see all of the major corporations in the state that have been year in and year out pushing for the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, which is legislation that really enjoys overwhelming public support. It has been the most co-sponsored piece of legislation drawing bipartisan support in Tallahassee. And but for opposition from leadership, we believe it would be brought to the floor and passed. There is overwhelming support among the public, including across party lines. In fact, we did polling in the midst of the last legislative session of Republican primary voters, and it showed that Republican primary voters were more willing to support a Republican candidate who supported the Florida Competitive Workforce Act than one who did not. So we think the time is really ripe, and today's incredible decision underscores that Florida ought to be a leader, ought to be a place where that isn't losing talent, but is drawing talent, and is delivering that clear message that we are open for business and open to all. And in fact, in addition to major corporations that are leading the charge, small businesses have spoken up clearly. We have hundreds and hundreds of businesses that have signed on to a program we have called Open Doors, or Puertas Abiertas. And those are businesses that have affirmed their own policies of non-discrimination and further called on local and state government to adopt those policies as well. And so we have with us a small business owner, Yamlet Strauss. The floor is yours. And Yamlet, you will have to go off of mute.
You think after doing this every day, you're used to it, right?
You're so excited about the ruling. That's what's happening.
Right. So very exciting for the ruling. Like I mentioned earlier, and I can't believe we had to wait this long. It's 2020. I think I'm excited about it. And like Nadine said, now it's about implementing and making sure that you know, the LGBT community is truly protected under this new ruling, and that they're not going to continue to be discriminations in the workforce. I'm extremely happy for what's going on now, and as I've always been involved with the community, if there is any way that I can also help in any way to you know, make this effort bigger, and making sure that moving forward it's implemented properly, and so that Florida will be a state that will set by example in the way that we would you know, manage its residents, including the LGBT community, which we know that it is a community that has been disregarded forever. So I'm glad that they get into protections. I'm happy to see that we're moving forward.
Wonderful. Well, one of the things that recently came out was a report about LGBTQ rights in the South. I'll drop the link in the chat in just a moment. But it talked about how the South is really far behind the rest of the country when it comes to these protections. But they also identified Florida as an outlier. And part of the reason for that is because we have been successful in pushing back on some very hostile legislation in Tallahassee, and because at the local level, we have been able to secure non-discrimination protections through human rights ordinances that include sexual orientation and gender identity. And in fact, those protections cover 60% of the population, but that's not enough. It's got to cover everyone. We should not have to look at our zip code or what city limits we are in or county we are occupying to know that we will be protected just like everyone else. And I want to introduce now a local partner, the Executive Director of SAVE, which is headquartered in Miami. Please welcome Orlando Gonzalez.
Hey, Nadine, thanks for pulling us all together. I think it's definitely a day to celebrate, but we know that this is a little blip in our path for full equality. And really what we're looking for, I think, moving forward is an opportunity to take this federal ruling and make sure that we codify the laws at the local and state level, and really be able to push forward in a way that provides full equality for our community. We are looking forward to continuing to work with Equality Florida so that we can seed the rest of the localities throughout the state, but also to do the work that we need to do at the state level. And the only way we know that we're probably going to do this is by electing pro-equality candidates. So in this very busy election year, we've got a lot of work to do. And so glad to be working with a lot of folks here. It's really a big day. I mean, you know that we all had tremendous amount of anxiety knowing that many of the people that were appointed to the court were not really coming from people in the White House that favored us in the past. And we heard the local arguments back in January. We were nervous because there was not a lot of confidence about the way that the arguments were received. So today is big in that way. I'm hoping that this is looked at as not just a moment of ruling on employment, but really ruling on something a little bit higher, which is that what was considered here was the Civil Rights Act, right? We were looking at it from that lens. Employment is just a sliver, and so I think that we need to really have the full legal analysis in the next couple of hours and days to look at how big this victory really is. So thanks a lot. Big kiss to you all.
Thank you, Orlando.
Miami. It's a hug and a kiss, right?
That's right. It's socially distant and acceptable. So without a doubt, this has been an amazing watershed moment. It comes at a time when our country needs some bright lights, some indicators that progress can be made even in difficult times. And for a country that is not only dealing with the inequities that COVID has laid bare, we are also grappling at long last with heavy issues of police brutality and what it means to protect and serve in this country. And so we see this as a tremendous victory in a context where the work continues. And part of that work has us calling on the governor and calling on the state legislature to take action, not to do the bare minimum that this court ruling calls on, but to do what is right, to do what is necessary to deliver the message that discrimination will not be accepted in our state, that equal opportunity is the law of the land, and that discrimination, there are remedies available. So we'll continue to do that work in Tallahassee. We'll continue to do that work at the local level, and we'll continue to add our voice to the push for a federal legislation. And so I want to thank all of our business leaders, our local leaders, John Davidson, for being our legal eagle on the call. And I want to throw the floor open for questions from media. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I have completely forgotten, and to my embarrassment, one of our own board members, also an attorney, Nathan Bremer, who has been a longtime advocate on these issues, and particularly has been a voice for transgender protections across the state. Nathan Bremer. Where are you? If you are speaking, Nathan, you are on mute.
I made the same Yami, I'm in the club with you. I'm too excited. Thanks for the introduction, Nadine. I know we've got a lot of analysis to do and a lot of experts. I'm not on the call today as an expert. I'm on the call as a native Floridian, born and raised in this state, as an out and proud transgender man. My entire life, I've had to be an advocate, and I hold all the plaintiffs in my heart today, and especially Amy Stevens. Every comment that you've heard is sort of recognizing this watershed moment, and as was alluded, really, when we're looking at the fight for justice and equity and fairness in our country, this decision is the floor, not the ceiling. Every aspect of my life has been impacted by discrimination. The trajectory of my professional life has been impacted, and I have experienced discrimination more times than I sometimes remember. When I start to share the stories with friends, I just get numb to them. And I am grateful for this decision and all the plaintiffs and all the work that all the legal teams did behind this to make it happen. I know the fight is not done. I think right now in this moment, I hold two things close to me. I think about the violence that my Black and brown trans siblings face and the incidences of murder, especially in Florida. We lead, unfortunately, in a statistic we don't want to lead, and that's the number of known trans murders for folks in a very short period of time. And I don't have health care. And so when we talk about what's next beyond employment and looking at passing the Florida Competitive Workforce Act and forcing, and looking at what's been told by this case and saying we have to do this across the board. During COVID, my greatest fear has been needing healthcare, and I have stayed quite close to home out of that need. And so with all of this celebration, as everyone has echoed, I am so grateful. But as a Floridian, to my legislators in Tallahassee and to all my representatives and senators in DC, we have to do the right thing. We have to make equity real for all Americans in this country. It is long overdue. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful for where we're at, but we need more. Thanks, Nadine.
Thank you, Nathan. I appreciate that. I see Jacob. Jacob Ogle, you there?
Yes, I'm here. I wanted to ask, and I think Orlando touched on this a little bit. I'm here with Florida Politics. I also write for The Advocate. There was mention of what the full ramifications of this mean and it being based on the Civil Rights Act. I know the Competitive Workforce Act asks not only for equality in job discrimination, but in housing and in discrimination in business. Is it your belief that you still need to pass that legislation, or that this court ruling is going to cover everything that the Civil Rights Act already guarantees based on race?
Let me send that to John Davidson for comment.
Yes. So yes, we still need Florida to pass comprehensive express sexual orientation and gender identity non-discrimination protections. The court ruled today about federal protections against employment discrimination. In doing so, it talked about how bans on sex discrimination, in its view, encompass discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. But there are no federal bans on sex discrimination in public spaces like hotels and restaurants and stores. And there are no bans on discrimination in sex discrimination in federally funded programs, aside from education. So adoption and foster care services, shelters, food banks. There is no ban on sex discrimination there, and therefore there are no federal prohibitions on sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination. In addition, with respect to the federal laws barring sex discrimination in other areas, housing, credit, healthcare, the court didn't have that in front of it. The reasoning of its decision should apply to those. And therefore, like Friday's rule change by the Department of Health and Human Services should go into the trash can. But courts will still have to rule on that. We don't have that expressly in the law. We should have no question for anyone that that is prohibited. And it should be prohibited at both the federal level and the state level. We need the same remedies that Florida provides for discrimination based on other invidious grounds to expressly be provided with respect to discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yeah, so just for total clarity, John's response was to underscore the need for these protections to be explicit and comprehensive at the state level. And we will continue to pursue securing those protections unambiguously in the state of Florida across the board. Other questions? Okay.
Nadine, I'm on the call. Sorry. Hey, this is Kirby Wilson from the Tampa Bay Times.
Okay, Kirby.
I'm sorry. I don't know how to enter questions, but just speaking up is okay.
You jump in, and then John McDonald will go next. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'm wondering, does Equality Florida, do you see this ruling as making it more likely for the legislature to take up matters of anti-discrimination, i.e. the momentum will continue, or less likely that members of the legislature will say, well, they have these protections in federal law. Why do we need them in the state?
Well, I think that's part of why we're holding this this media conference. We want people to understand that this does not in any way reduce the need for the state legislature and the governor to act. In fact, we hope that it will prod the legislature into action. It is clear that the U.S. Supreme Court, the overwhelming majority of the public, more than 60% of the population currently live in places that have these protections. It really comes down to a small handful of people that are blocking progress. And it's our hope that today's ruling will be part of the momentum to stop that and allow these protections to become codified comprehensively in Florida law. And, as I said at the top of the hour, what is clear is that there is bipartisan support for these protections. The governor's own pollster did research that showed Republican primary voters overwhelmingly support these protections and are more likely to vote for a Republican candidate in a primary who has supported the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, or even if it's phrased as, LGBTQ protections, they support it. And so we think that this is a moment where the Florida legislature and the governor will understand that we can either be dragged forward as a state reluctantly doing the minimum that is required, or we will be a state that embraces equal opportunity and make sure that those protections exist across the state. And I hope that what we will see is a legislature ready to act. John.
Hi. Hi, Nadine. Thank you. I appreciate the work and congratulations on the big victory. Could you talk about the process, the momentum specifically? Have you got plans for the legislature? Who's going to do the heavy lifting? Is there a strategy in Tallahassee of getting this done and accomplished?
My goodness, man, we just got the order. Yeah, well, certainly. And we have built, as I said, the Florida Competitive Workforce Act has been for multiple years the most co-sponsored piece of legislation. It has drawn bipartisan support. We'll be turning to those same leaders who have stepped up in the past to continue to carry the ball. You see on this call, Florida Competes, the coalition of business leaders who are just as energized as we are to see this passed. And there's an understanding that not only is it the right thing to do, but economically it is the smart thing to do. It is the right message to send. And it's our hope that the legislature and the governor will understand that this is a moment where we actually need them to lead. And, in this economy, we have a program called Open Doors Florida, which includes businesses large and small. And one of the messages as the economy reopens and businesses are trying to make sure people come back, people are asking, what are the values of those businesses? Who are they? Do they stand with us? Will they treat my family with the same respect? And so a lot of people are using that as a guide, not only to where they want to work, but where they want to spend their dollars. And in that environment, we think it's important for the business community to continue to be that voice and for the legislature to act. And I do think that this gives momentum to that. Other questions? And if you're on the phone and you can't raise your hand, you can just blurt out your question or introduce yourself. We won't stand on ceremony. Other questions? If you are talking right now, you are muted. We cannot hear you. All right. Any final thoughts from our panelists before we say farewell? Oh, okay. Gaffney. My mic doesn't work. Will Equality Florida be pushing any bills other than the Florida Competitive Workforce Act? Too soon to know. We usually have a pretty full agenda every legislative session. So the short answer is very likely. What those are, we need time to huddle, but we will definitely make it known as bills that we support, and just as importantly, bills that we do not support begin to make their way through the legislature. We had a legislative session where we saw a whole slate of very hostile bills. Thankfully, we were able to block all of those bad bills, as we have every legislative session since we became an organization. So stay tuned. Any other questions?
Nadine, can I say something in closing?
Yes, please do.
I just want to thank JT and Yami and Amy and all of the businesses that are out there supporting the LGBTQ community. As someone who's faced discrimination repeatedly, that commitment, that public commitment to proactively and intentionally do the work means everything. One of the first comments on my Facebook post about this decision came from a trans woman who echoes basically the lack of trust. Yep, we have the decision, but now what? Because for those of us that are facing this discrimination every day, we need those partners and those allies to show up, and probably now more than ever. So thank you all. And for those businesses not on the call, we've got to keep doing the work, and it's got to be intentional. You know, if our resumes don't look quite right, and if you're doing recruitment, just keep that in mind for the next level of the conversation. I really wanted to just express the gratitude for them showing up.
Hear, hear. Any other parting thoughts before we say goodbye to our media friends and our viewers on Facebook?
I'll lead or bounce off Nathan's comment there and say, on behalf of Tech Data and on behalf of the Florida Competes Business Association and conglomerate, that today we see as a huge bolt of right. And an exciting moment, but it will galvanize us, with the right tone being set at the top by the Supreme Court to say that that equality is complete and stands in the era we're in. We as businesses and Florida Competes will be re-energized to take that clear signal from the top and drive for systematic change in the places where that now needs to be turned into law and turned into action and turned into habit and then really turned into pride.
Thank you, JT. Anyone else before we sign off? So go ahead.
Hey, Nadine, it's Dara Cam with the News Service of Florida. I apologize. I thought my mute was on and you could probably hear me typing. So I apologize for that. And I understand, and congratulations on this historic ruling. But what makes you all think that the legislature is going to do something different than what they have done all along, even, aside from this ruling?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's a way to define what they've done all along. I think when this bill was first introduced, there were Democrats who were reluctant to put their name on it. As it has traveled through the process, it has picked up support from a lot of different quarters. It didn't have broad support from the business community when it first launched. And so support has grown consistently, the bipartisan nature of that support. And I think even the folks that JT mentions having lobbied over time have spoken of this as inevitable legislation, that is just around the corner. And for them, they've clearly, as leadership, made some political calculation that they don't want it on their time. But I think the pressure that's built up on both sides of the political aisle and in this moment, that's what's part of changing that environment. And if you look at how much this country has changed since March as a response to COVID and as a response to a nation that did not look away for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I think that there's a recognition that equity and justice are at the forefront of people's thinking right now, and that work has a momentum that we have not experienced before.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I just want to thank again everyone, all of our business leaders, Nathan, for bringing that important perspective and voice. And in addition to all of the legal teams, our good friends at Freedom for All Americans, John Davidson, who's no stranger to Supreme Court battles. And I just want to add a thanks to everyone who's ever stood up in a city council hearing and told their story, everyone who's ever made that trip to Tallahassee, the part of the state I grew up in, which is hard to get to from any population center in the state, and to the plaintiffs who've stepped forward and stood in that fishbowl and had their lives scrutinized in order to pursue these critical protections. It happens because of all of us doing that work day in and day out. So thank you for joining us. If media have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Brandon at equalityflorida.org, and he can sort of triage and direct you to whoever it is you need to speak with. Orlando Gonzalez from SAVE, thank you for joining us. And let us celebrate and fortify ourselves for the work that lies ahead. Take care.
Bye.